Today's story takes us back to 1859 and into the life of Thomas Wiggins, a black boy forced to live under harsh exploitation who could sit at a piano and play with the brilliance of Mozart, yet never spoke a single word. People called it a miracle, but behind the applause there was a darker reality that few were willing to admit. This is a heavy and intense story, so take a moment, breathe slowly, and listen with care. Before we begin, subscribe and tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. Your support helps keep these stories alive instead of forgotten. Let's begin. In the summer of 1858, inside a crowded concert hall in Columbus, Georgia, something happened that no one present could explain. More than 800 people filled the hall that night. Wealthy plantation owners occupied the front rows, their wives dressed in silk and satin. Local politicians whispered quietly to one another. Newspaper reporters held their notebooks tight, waiting for something worth printing. Everyone had paid good money to see what posters advertised as the greatest musical curiosity in the American South, yet none of them were ready for what they were about to see. The stage was plain, with only a grand piano polished until it reflected the gaslight, sitting alone at center stage. The room fell silent when a white man in a well-fitted suit stepped forward and lifted his hand. His name was James Neal Bethune, a lawyer and former newspaper editor who had built his wealth through land and enslaved people. He smiled at the crowd like a showman about to unveil his prize. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "what you are about to witness will challenge everything you believe about the Negro race. What you are about to hear will make you question the very nature of God's creation. I present to you a boy who cannot read a single word, a boy who cannot write his own name, a boy doctors have declared mentally deficient, barely able to feed or dress himself. And yet, this same boy will sit at this piano and perform musical feats that even Europe's greatest composers could not match." The crowd murmured. Some laughed uneasily, others leaned forward. Bethune paused, then gestured toward the side of the stage. "I give you blind, Tom." A small figure stepped out of the shadows. He was 8 years old, though he looked younger. His skin appeared almost blue-black under the gaslight. His eyes were closed, clouded by thick, milky cataracts that had left him blind since birth. He walked with an unusual shuffling gait, his head bobbing slightly, his hands moving in a strange, rhythmic motion. The audience gasped. Some women covered their mouths. A few men shook their heads in pity or disgust. This was not what they expected. This did not look like a performer. This looked like a broken child, clearly damaged, obviously simple-minded. Several people began to rise from their seats, ready to demand refunds. But then the boy reached the piano. He did not need help finding the bench. His fingers brushed the wood until he found the keys. He sat down, adjusted himself, and placed his hands on the keyboard. The room went completely still. Then Thomas Wiggins began to play. What came from the piano was unlike anything those 800 people had ever heard. It was Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata, one of the most difficult works in classical music, a piece professionals spent years trying to master. The blind child played it perfectly. His fingers moved with unbelievable speed and accuracy. Every note was exact. Every phrase matched Beethoven's intent. The music swelled and softened like ocean waves, gentle one moment, crashing the next. When he finished, no one clapped. The audience sat frozen, unable to understand what they had just witnessed. Bethune smiled. He had seen this before. "If any gentleman or lady would like to test young Tom," he announced, "please come forward. Play any piece you wish, no matter how difficult or obscure. Tom will hear it once and reproduce it exactly." A man in the third row stood. He was a trained music teacher who had studied in Philadelphia. With a doubtful look, he walked to the stage, sat at a second piano, and played a complex Chopin etude filled with fast scales and intricate movements. Tom sat still, his blind eyes unfocused, his head slightly tilted as if listening to something far away. When the man finished, he turned with a confident smile. Sure the trick was over, Tom placed his hands on the keys and played the piece back. At the 17th measure, the crowd erupted. For the next hour, one person after another tested the boy. A church organist played a hymn he had composed himself. Tom repeated it perfectly. A woman played two different melodies, one with each hand. Tom played both at once, then added a third melody of his own using the pedals. A German immigrant played a folk song from his homeland and sang along. Tom played it back and hummed the tune, copying the man's accent exactly. By the end of the night, grown men were crying. Women fainted. The music teacher sat with his head in his hands, whispering that his life had been wasted, and James Bethune stood to the side, silently counting money in his mind. That night in Columbus was not Tom's first performance, and it would not be his last. Over the next 50 years, the blind boy from Georgia would become the most famous musician in America. He would perform for presidents and generals. He would tour the country and Europe to standing ovations. He would earn what would equal more than $20 million today. Yet Thomas Wiggins would never see a cent of it. He would never choose where he lived, what he ate, or when he slept. He would never have friends, a wife, or a family of his own. In every way that mattered, he remained a slave even after slavery officially ended, even until the day he died. This is the true story of Blind Tom, the greatest musical genius America ever produced, and the story of how America destroyed him. Thomas Green Wiggins was born on May 25, 1849, on a plantation in Harris County, Georgia, near Columbus. His mother was an enslaved woman named Charity, owned by a man named Wiley Jones. Charity had already given birth to many children, most of whom had been sold away over the years. Tom was her 13th child, and from birth it was clear he was different. He was born with thick white cataracts covering his eyes, completely blind. Soon Charity noticed other differences. He did not respond to his name. He did not look at faces. He did not cry when hungry or uncomfortable. He lay silent and still, as if absent. Other enslaved people whispered that he was cursed. Some said he had no soul. Even Charity, who loved him deeply, sometimes wondered if anything was truly inside that small body. In 1850, when Tom was about 18 months old, Wiley Jones decided to sell slaves to cover debts. At the Columbus market, James Bethune noticed Charity holding her child. Bethune examined them like murk, hand ice. Charity was strong and valuable. The child was blind and unresponsive, likely useless. Jones sold them together for a low price, knowing no one would buy the child alone. Bethune hesitated but agreed. That purchase would change everything. Life at the plantation was hard. Charity worked long hours while Tom stayed with older women. He never spoke. He rocked, hummed, and explored the world through sound. He pressed his ear to the ground, tapped walls, and listened to storms like music. Others thought him touched or foolish. The Bethune family ignored him completely. Everything changed one summer night in 1855 when Tom followed the sound of piano music to the main house. After the family slept, he entered the parlor and began to play. The sound woke everyone. They found the blind child playing perfectly. In that moment, Bethune realized he had found something extraordinary. From then on, Bethune tested Tom, then exploited him. He advertised him as a curiosity, toured him across the South, and made a fortune. Tom played flawlessly every night, yet remained enslaved, controlled, and used. Modern experts believe Tom was autistic with savant syndrome, but in his time he was labeled an idiot. That label made it easier to exploit him. Yet Tom showed awareness, preferences, emotions, and artistic choice. He could refuse to play. He could mock music he disliked. He composed endlessly. This was not a machine. This was an artist. By 1860, Blind Tom was famous, wealthy for others, and still enslaved. His existence shattered the lies used to justify slavery, yet those lies were twisted to keep profiting from him. Abolitionists pointed to him as proof of injustice, while Bethune worked to protect his investment as the nation moved toward war. In 1859, he created a legal contract with Tom's parents, Charity and her husband Mingo, who was enslaved on a nearby plantation. The paper claimed that the Wiggins family agreed to let Bethune keep Tom and control his career in exchange for a small yearly payment and a promise that Tom would be treated well. The contract was meaningless. Charity and Mingo could not legally sign agreements because they were enslaved. They could not bargain because they had no power. They could not refuse because refusal meant punishment or being sold away. The document existed only to protect Bethune, giving him paperwork he could show in court if anyone ever questioned his control over Tom. And that challenge came sooner than expected. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the Civil War began. The South left the Union. James Bethune, a devoted Confederate, sent his sons to fight. He gave money and supplies to the Southern Army and continued touring with Blind Tom, holding concerts across the Confederacy to raise funds and lift spirits. Tom became, in effect, a tool for Confederate propaganda. Bethune presented him as proof that slavery was kind and generous, showing that enslaved people were cared for and then allowed to develop talents under white supervision. Southern newspapers praised Tom as a symbol of Southern culture and refinement. Confederate generals attended his concerts and congratulated Bethune. What Tom felt about any of this is unknown. He could not speak or write. He could not share his thoughts in ways white people accepted. He simply played what he was told, performed the tricks demanded of him, and kept his thoughts locked inside his silent mind. But perhaps his music was his voice. During the war years, Tom began composing pieces with names like the Battle of Manassas and March to the Battlefield, presented as celebrations of Confederate victories. Southern audiences loved them, hearing pride and triumph in the music. Yet modern music experts have noticed something unusual. Beneath the bold melodies are dark elements, harsh chords that sound like cries, rhythms that resemble cracking whips, and sad passages that suggest grief rather than victory. Some researchers believe Tom hid his true feelings about war and slavery inside the music, expressing resistance in a way his white audiences could not fully understand. If so, Blind Tom was not only a victim, he was quietly rebelling, hiding defiance in plain sight while Confederate crowds applauded. The war ended in April 1865 with Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox. A month later, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. 4 million enslaved people were suddenly free, including Tom's mother Charity and his father Mingo. Tom should have been free as well. He was 16 years old, a young man who had spent his life performing and earning money for others. He had brought in hundreds of thousands of dollars. He deserved freedom and control over his own life. But James Bethune had other ideas. Soon after the war, Bethune went to court and asked to become Tom's legal guardian. He claimed Tom was mentally unfit, unable to care for himself, and needed a responsible white man to manage his affairs. Doctors testified that Tom was an idiot with the mind of a child. They pointed to his silence, his behavior, his confusion. The court agreed. In 1865, the same year slavery ended, Thomas Wiggins was declared a legal ward of James Neal Bethune. Tom was free in name only. Nothing truly changed. Bethune still controlled his life and money. The chains were replaced with legal documents. This was common across the South. New laws found ways to control black labor without calling it slavery. Black codes limited movement and work. Vagrancy laws forced people into unpaid labor. Sharecropping trapped families in endless debt. But Tom's case was different. He was not a field worker. He was the most famous musician in America, a genius who had performed for presidents, and still, in every real way, he remained enslaved. The tours continued. Bethune took Tom north for the first time, performing in New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. Northern crowds filled the halls. Abolitionists protested outside some shows demanding Tom's freedom. But the concerts went on, and the money kept flowing. In 1866, Tom played at the White House for President Andrew Johnson. Johnson was impressed, though. What Tom felt about performing for a man undermining Reconstruction is unknown. By the late 1860s, Tom had earned millions in today's money. He owned nothing, not a house, not a dollar, not even his clothes. Everything belonged to James Bethune. Tom's mother Charity watched helplessly. After emancipation, she worked as a domestic servant, poor and powerless. In 1870, she tried to fight back. She hired a lawyer and sued for custody of her son. The case dragged on for years. Bethune's lawyers argued Charity was unfit, that she lacked resources, that removing Tom would ruin his career. The court agreed. Charity lost. She died a few years later, never holding her son again. Tom played on year after year, trapped in the only life he knew. In 1882, a New York Times reporter visited him in Warrenton, Virginia. Tom was 32, sitting in a dark room, rocking gently, humming, tapping his fingers. He did not respond to questions. When asked to play, he performed for nearly 2 hours, moving through Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, folk songs, hymns, and his own strange, beautiful compositions. The reporter left in tears and called him the greatest musical genius he had ever seen, but also a prisoner. Nothing changed. The 1870s and 1880s were the height of Tom's fame. He toured endlessly, even performing for Queen Victoria and the German Emperor. Yet success brought no freedom. James Bethune controlled everything. Tom grew exhausted, lonely, and isolated. He had no friends, no relationships, no community. In 1875, guardianship passed to Bethune's son, John. John was cruel and unstable. Under his control, Tom's life worsened. He was insulted, threatened, possibly beaten. His behavior changed. He withdrew, resisted performing, and showed distress. He was trapped. In 1887, after a bitter divorce, custody passed to John's ex-wife, Eliza. She treated Tom slightly better, but still saw him as property. As Tom aged, his abilities declined. He forgot pieces, stopped mid-performance, refused to play. Some see this as resistance, his only way to say no. Others see decline. Either way, his value faded. In 1898, a civil rights lawyer named Albion Torgi took up Tom's case, arguing that guardianship was being used to continue slavery. The courts disagreed. Tom was declared incompetent and kept under control. By 1900, Tom lived quietly in Hoboken, New Jersey. His fame was gone, but he still played, alone, for hours each day. What he felt, what he remembered, we will never know. He could only speak through music. In interviews, Eliza described him as happy and simple. Others disagreed. Servants said he was often silent and sad. Neighbors heard him play the same mournful tune late at night. A doctor noted signs of deep depression. Blind Tom, once the most famous musician in America, lived his final years forgotten, unheard, and still not free. The truth likely sits somewhere in the middle. Tom was not the happy, simple soul that Eliza described, and he was not exactly the tragic symbol that others later turned him into. He was a complicated human being, with thoughts, emotions, and experiences we can only imagine. His life was unusual and intense, filled with success and pain, fame and abuse, brilliance and suffering, and eventually that life came to its quiet end. On June 13, 1908, Thomas Green Wiggins died from a stroke at the age of 59. He died alone in a small room in Hoboken, far away from the grand concert halls where he once amazed audiences and far from the plantation where he was born into slavery. His death received only brief mention in a handful of newspapers, usually as a strange curiosity, a small note tied to a past age. The headlines called him Blind Tom, the name given by his owners, a label that reduced his entire life to a disability and a stage nickname. Very few papers used his full name. Very few recognized him as a man. Very few cared that he was gone. Eliza Bethune arranged a simple funeral. Tom was buried in Evergreen Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York, in a grave without a marker. The man who had played for presidents and royalty, who had performed in the finest halls across America and Europe, who had earned vast sums of money during his career, was placed in the ground without even a stone to mark where he lay. For almost 100 years, no one knew the location of Thomas Wiggins's grave. It was lost, forgotten, much like the man himself. It was only in 1976 that researchers finally found his remains, buried in a plot bought by Eliza Bethune under her own name instead of his. In 2002, a proper headstone was finally added. It reads, Thomas Wiggins Bethune, Blind Tom, 1849 to 1908, renowned pianist and composer. The marker includes both his slave name and his stage name, identities forced on him by white owners who saw him mainly as a source of income, but it also names what he truly was: a pianist, a composer, an artist. It took 94 years for America to place those words on his grave. 94 years to admit that Thomas Wiggins was more than a curiosity, more than a spectacle, more than property. He was a musician, one of the greatest of his time. The story of Blind Tom forces us to face questions America has still not fully answered. How do we deal with the exploitation of black brilliance? How do we measure the wealth taken from enslaved and formerly enslaved people? How do we honor those who were robbed not only of freedom, but of identity itself? Tom earned the modern equivalent of more than $20 million during his lifetime, and every cent of it went to white hands. First to James Bethune, then to John Bethune, and later to Eliza Bethune. The family that bought Tom as damaged property became unimaginably wealthy because of his talent. And what did Tom receive? A place to sleep, food to eat, clothes to wear. Only the basics needed to keep him alive. These were not gifts of kindness, but investments meant to keep the money flowing. This was the reality of Blind Tom's life. He was treated not as a person, but as a product, not as an artist, but as an attraction, not as a human being, but as a tool used to generate profit for others. Some defenders of the Bethunes argue that they deserved payment for managing Tom's career. They claim that without them, he would have remained an unknown slave on a plantation in Georgia. They say they gave him opportunities he could never have created on his own. There is a small amount of truth in this. Tom could not have organized tours by himself. He could not have negotiated contracts or managed money. He needed assistance to survive in a world he could not see. But this argument ignores the deep injustice at the center of the arrangement. Tom did not choose his managers. He did not agree to the conditions of his work. He did not consent to giving up all his earnings in exchange for food and shelter. These choices were made for him by people who benefited from keeping him dependent and controlled. A fair arrangement would have looked very different. Tom could have been paid honestly for his work, with part of his earnings saved for his care and future. He could have been educated and supported in ways that allowed him as much independence as possible. He could have been treated as a human being with rights, not as property to be used. But that would have required white America to see him as fully human, and white America was not ready to do that. Not in 1858 when he first performed, not in 1865 when slavery legally ended, not in 1908 when he died. The myth of black inferiority was too useful, too comfortable, too deeply rooted in American society. And so Tom lived and died as a slave in all but name. His story was largely forgotten, reduced to a footnote in American music history, an uneasy reminder of truths many preferred to ignore. Yet there is something remarkable about Thomas Wiggins. Despite the cruelty, the exploitation, and the constant denial of his humanity, he left behind something his oppressors could never take from him. He left his music. Tom wrote more than 100 original pieces during his life. Many of them were never written down and have been lost forever, but some survived, and they reveal a mind of great depth and complexity. His most famous work, The Battle of Manassas, is a musical portrait of the Confederate victory in the first major battle of the Civil War. On the surface, it sounds like praise for the South, exactly the kind of piece James Bethune wanted. But listen carefully and another story emerges. You hear disorder and fear, you hear pain and death, you hear the real horror of war expressed in sound, while white audiences applauded without truly understanding. Another piece, The Rainstorm, recreates a violent thunderstorm with startling realism. It begins softly, like light rain on a roof. The wind grows stronger. The rain becomes heavier. Thunder crashes. The music rises to an intense peak, then slowly fades into calm. It is a brilliant example of storytelling through sound, something few composers have ever achieved. But perhaps the most revealing music Tom created were the pieces without names, the melodies he improvised late at night, alone, wherever he happened to be sleeping. These were never meant for audiences. They were never written down. They were private, a personal language for feelings he could not speak. People who overheard these moments described them in almost spiritual terms. They spoke of music that felt otherworldly, unbearably sad, strangely joyful, or beyond normal understanding. They felt as if they were listening to something sacred, something not meant for them. What was Tom expressing in those moments? Was he grieving for his lost mother? Was he angry about his captivity? Was he imagining a freedom he would never know? Or was he simply feeling the pure joy of creation, the one thing no one could steal from him? We cannot know for sure. But we know that he played every day for 50 years. He played through slavery and war, through loneliness and exploitation, through despair and isolation. He played. Music was his shelter, his quiet rebellion, his form of resistance. It was the only part of his life that truly belonged to him. And in the end, that music is what endured. The Bethunes are forgotten, remembered because of their connection to Tom. Their wealth is gone, their power has faded. But Tom's music is still played, studied, and admired. Pianists still marvel at it. Audiences still feel it, even if they do not know his name. In this way, Tom won. Not the victory he deserved, not justice or freedom or fair reward, but a victory all the same. His genius outlived those who exploited him. His art rose above his suffering. There is a lesson here, though it is not an easy one. The lesson is not that talent always wins or that justice always arrives in the end. Tom's life proves the opposite. Talent can be abused. Genius can be trapped. Justice can be delayed forever. The lesson is simpler and deeper. Human beings are more than what is done to them. They are more than the labels forced upon them. They are more than the names they are given or the roles they are pushed into. Tom was called an idiot, yet he was a genius. He was called property, yet he was a person. He was called Blind Tom, as if blindness and a nickname could define him. But he was Thomas Green Wiggins, a man who had a mother who loved him, a mind that created beauty, and a spirit that endured. Those who exploited him wanted to turn him into a thing, a source of profit without a soul. They wanted his talent without acknowledging his inner life. In material terms, they succeeded. They took his money, controlled his body, and owned his labor. But they failed to erase him. They failed to silence him. They failed to turn him into nothing. Because Tom spoke through music. Every time he played, he spoke. Every composition was a declaration. Every note proved that inside the body they called defective, inside the mind they called inferior, there was something real, valuable, and deeply human. This is how Blind Tom should be remembered, not only for the injustice he suffered, though that must never be ignored, not only for the cruelty he endured, though that must be faced honestly, but also for the triumph of a man who, despite everything meant to destroy him, continued to create and exist. Tom never got revenge in any ordinary way. He never escaped. He never confronted his oppressors. He never received what was taken from him. He died as he lived, dependent on people who refused to see him as fully human. But there is another kind of revenge. The revenge of survival, the revenge of endurance, the revenge of leaving behind something your enemies cannot destroy. James Bethune is dust. John Bethune is dust. Eliza Bethune is dust. Their plans, their legal tricks, their careful exploitation, all of it has turned to dust. But somewhere right now, someone is playing one of Tom's compositions. Somewhere, someone is hearing his music for the first time and feeling something awaken inside them. Somewhere, his genius is reaching across more than a century to touch another human being. That is Tom's revenge. It is quiet, not dramatic, not like a movie ending, but it is real and lasting. The boy who never spoke said everything that mattered. He said it through music, and we are still listening. In recent years, more people have begun to recognize Tom's role in American music and to confront the injustice of his life. Scholars have studied his works closely, searching for meaning and structure. Historians have uncovered new records that add depth to his story. Performers have recorded his music and introduced it to new audiences. Some have called for formal honors like induction into music halls of fame. Others have suggested a museum or memorial. Some have even argued for reparations, saying the Bethune family should return part of the wealth taken from Tom's labor. These efforts matter. They help correct the record and restore dignity to his name. but they also raise hard questions. Can any late recognition make up for what was done? Can a monument truly represent a life spent without freedom? Can money ever repay 50 years of stolen life? Probably not. What was taken from Tom cannot be returned. The injustice of his life cannot be undone. But perhaps the goal is not to repair the past, but to learn from it. To see in Tom's story a warning about treating people as property. To understand how American history and American music were built on exploitation and theft. Tom's life was shaped by forces he could not control. He was born enslaved, sold, exploited, controlled, and forgotten. Decisions were always made for him, never by him. Laws, customs, and money decided his fate. And yet within those limits he found a way to be himself. He found a way to create. He found a way to leave something behind that would outlast those who owned him. This is the paradox of his life. He was powerless, yet powerful, silenced, yet speaking, treated as nothing, yet undeniably something extraordinary. If Tom could speak to us now, what would he say? Would he be angry? Would he mourn the life he never had? Would he be proud of his music? Would he care what we think so long after his death? We will never know. His thoughts died with him, sealed inside a mind the world dismissed. But we still have his music, and in that music, if we truly listen, we can hear a voice rising from darkness, a voice demanding to be heard, a voice insisting on its worth and its humanity. In the end, what Thomas Wiggins gave the world was not only music but proof that genius has no color, proof that the human spirit cannot be fully crushed by chains, laws, or cruelty, proof that beauty can rise from even the darkest places. Those who exploited Tom wanted to prove the opposite. They used him to support ideas of black inferiority and justify slavery. They displayed him as a curiosity, a strange exception shaped by white control. But their logic collapsed. If black people were truly inferior, how could a blind enslaved child surpass the finest white musicians? If they were meant only for labor, how could such creativity exist? Tom himself was a contradiction they could not explain away. They tried. They called him a freak, an accident, an imitator with no real mind. But anyone who truly listened knew better. His music was not empty or mechanical. It was art. It was feeling. It was thought. Tom disproved their lies simply by playing. He did not need speeches or protests. Every note did the work for him. This is Blind Tom's legacy, not just his compositions, though they are priceless, not just the record of his suffering, though it must be remembered, but the undeniable fact of his genius, proof that black minds are not inferior, proof that human potential cannot be measured by skin color. That proof came at a terrible cost. Tom paid with his freedom, his earnings, his happiness. He endured what would have broken most people, and all he received in return was the chance to play. But that was enough. Through music, he escaped the prison built around him. Through art, he defeated the ideas meant to erase him. This is the revenge of Blind Tom. A revenge not of violence, but of truth. A revenge of beauty. A revenge that lasts. The boy who never spoke had the final word, and that word was music.